There's not much point sugarcoating it. The reality of food poisoning abroad is pretty gruesome, and chances are if you're jetting off on holiday soon, you're picturing something along the lines of exploring a new city or dipping your toes in the sand and making memories, not being stuck in a room with food poisoning. So in today's video, I'm sharing my top tips to help you avoid getting sick on holiday. Hi, I'm Jenna, a fully qualified EHO and mum of two, and welcome back to my channel. Just a little reminder before I get into today is to hit the subscribe button, as I drop weekly videos answering your real life kitchen questions and giving you all the tips and advice you need for generally easier meal times, building a freezer stash, meal prepping, all that good kind of stuff. So I'm going to start by saying that the good news is that some of the main pieces of food hygiene legislation that food businesses have followed here in the UK for many years is actually EU legislation. This therefore means that the standards within food businesses across countries in the EU shouldn't be hugely dissimilar to those in the UK. But as with everywhere, there's always going to be the good ones and the not so good ones. And believe me, a good restaurant doesn't necessarily mean that you can't still get food poisoning wherever you are in the world. And this advice is particularly important if you're travelling with babies or young children, because children under 5 are more vulnerable to food poisoning, so it's perfectly normal to be a little more cautious with food choices you're offering a baby or a toddler, for example, versus what you might feel comfortable eating yourself. But let's get into why you're here. How can you avoid food poisoning on holiday? Don't assume the water is safe to drink. Drinking water in different parts of the world is not always safe to drink. But even if it's not rife with bacteria, the chemicals and minerals contained in water abroad could still be different than what you're used to and give you an upset stomach. So if you can, especially if you're only abroad for a short amount of time, try and stick to bottled water. And a little reminder, if you're giving this bottled water to children, make sure you check the sodium content is below 200 milligrams per litre and that the sulfates is less than 250 milligrams per litre. And don't forget that if you're not drinking the tap water abroad, you also need to be careful with foods that might be washed in this tap water. So for example, salads and washed fruits, as well as ice and drinks. Number 2, avoid undercooked meat and raw fish and shellfish. When you're abroad, you might come across dishes on the menu that are popular in the local area, like steak tartare, carpaccio, or oysters, for example. But just be aware that these kinds of foods do carry a higher risk of foodborne illness. The same also goes for rare burgers. So rare burgers are not the same as rare steaks, as the mincing of the meat means that the bacteria is transferred from the outside of the meat onto the inside. So it's worth being cautious with these kinds of foods. And again, if you are traveling with a young child, always make sure that their meat is fully cooked, even if you're ordering something like chicken nuggets. That reminds me of one time I was in Tenerife a few years ago, typical chain restaurant. We was with my sister and her family, and my nephew was 5 at the time, ordered a plate of chicken nuggets, you know how it goes, chicken nuggets and chips, and he was given a whole plate of chicken nuggets that were not only still raw inside, but actually still frozen. So even if you're not ordering something that's particularly considered high risk, it's always worth cutting open your children's food and actually making sure that it is fully cooked. Number 3, avoid runny eggs. Here in the UK, we are quite fortunate that we have 2 schemes, the British Lion Code and Laid in Britain, which means that eggs produced under these schemes have been laid by hens vaccinated against salmonella. Therefore, meaning that the risk of salmonella from these eggs is so low that they are safe to be eaten undercooked by babies as young as 6 months or people within vulnerable groups such as pregnant ladies, immunocompromised and the elderly, for example. However, other countries do not have these schemes in place. And again, this is particularly important if you do fall into a vulnerable group or you are traveling with someone who does. If you're offering eggs, avoid runny eggs and instead just make sure you go for ones that are fully cooked. Number 4, be careful eating food from street vendors. Fortunately, street vendors may not always follow the same food hygiene or preparation standards as restaurants, particularly when it comes to hand washing. So just be cautious and selective when you're eating food off of a street market. And use your judgment. So for example, if the stool looks dirty, you can see lots of food sitting out, especially if that's rice, or there's loads of flies around, then it's best to avoid and ideally only choose the food that you can see that has been cooked fresh in front of you. And number 5, are all-inclusive buffets. Personally, I've got 2 kids. I love the choice and freedom we get as a family when eating at a buffet, but there are a few things you need to bear in mind. If you can, try to get to the buffet within the first 2 hours of it opening. In reality, yes, most buffets will have controls in place, such as hot lamps, rotating food, serving little and often, in order to keep food hot and therefore out of the danger zone, which is where bacteria multiply rapidly. But by eating within the first couple of hours of food being put out on the buffet, you can be confident that the food hasn't been allowed to sit at room temperature for too long. And remember that there's always lots of food being cooked for a buffet, so always double check any meat you're serving to any young children to make sure it's cooked all the way through. I feel like I have a couple of these stories, but I do remember on Chloe's first holiday abroad, she was 12 months old, and as we cut open her sausage, we was making sure that it wasn't a choking hazard for her, so we was cutting it into quarters, into long quarters. We could see that it was still pink in the middle, so it's always worth double checking. And last but not least, if you're taking food from the buffet to eat at lunchtime or as snacks throughout the day, maybe you're going out for the day, then only take food that is safe to be kept at room temperature for hours, like bread, croissants, muffins, etc. If you want to start taking cold meats, really any cold meat out of temperature control should be eaten within 4 hours, and likely if you're in a hot country or you're going out for the day, it's going to exceed that time, so it's probably just not worth the risk. So there we go, that sums up my 5 tips to help you and your family avoid food poisoning whilst on holiday. And if you're wondering what symptoms to look out for when it comes to food poisoning, then symptoms can obviously vary from person to person, but you'll be looking out for things like feeling sick, having diarrhea, actually being sick, vomiting, stomach cramps, having a fever, so a temperature of above 38 degrees, and just generally feeling unwell, like having aches and chills. And just remember, it's not always the last food that made you ill. So food poisoning can come on fairly quickly, say after a few hours, but most commonly it's actually between 1 and 3 days after actually eating the food. And of course, don't be afraid to get medical attention if you need it or if you notice blood in your stools. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to leave it there. I hope you found this video useful, and if you did and you're going on holiday this summer, then make sure you give it a thumbs up. We're off to Tenerife this summer with a toddler and a 6-year-old, so if there's anything you want to see before we go or whilst we're there, let me know in the comments.